Hi, everybody, and welcome back to TGCS. My name is Tim Gallagher. Today, we're going to be discussing AP Computer Science A Topic 4.5, Implementing Array Algorithms. And in this first of three videos, we'll develop code for standard and original algorithms and determine the result of these algorithms. Now, over the next few videos, we'll have a lot of algorithms to cover. But in this first video, we're going to focus on these three algorithms. First, we'll compute the sum or average of all the elements in an array. Next, we'll determine the number of elements in an array having a particular property. And finally, we'll determine if at least one element in an array has a particular property. Okay, before we write our code for any of the algorithms, it's important to figure out what it is we need to do exactly, what our constraints might be, what results are going to be produced, and so on. So some of the questions that we might want to ask before we write any code might be, what's our goal? Do we need to get a value or a location or a calculation? What type of result do we want? What type of values are in the array? Are they objects or primitive types? How can we compare, accumulate, or check an attribute of the contents of the array? And finally, do we need to traverse the entire array? What would be the conditions where we could halt our algorithm before we traverse through the entire data structure? All right, let's look at our first one. Here, we're going to find the average of the values in an array. So in order to do that, we're going to traverse through this array called values, and you'll notice that there's 10 integers in here. So in order to do the average, we need to add them all up together and divide by the number of values that we have. So first, we're going to have some sort of sum variable here. And then we'll visit each element in the array. And as we visit each element, like the 20, we're going to add this to our sum. We visit the 12, we add that to our sum. Our sum is now 32. We visit the 8, we add that to our sum, and we have 40. And you can see we'll continue as we traverse through the array. We add 55, we're up to 253. We add the 3, we have 256. And finally, when we get to the last location, the 21, that increases our sum to 277. So that's our sum. Now, what do we have to do? Well, we're going to have to divide the sum by the number of values. Well, we could say divide by 10, but we want this to work for any array. So how do we know how many elements are in the array regardless of how we declared it? We're going to use values.length. So sum divided by values.length is going to give us the average. That's our algorithm. So let's write the code now. Here we have a static method called getAverage that takes an array parameter of integers called values, and it's going to return a double, which should be the average of all those. So feel free to pause the video here and take a shot at writing this method yourself before we go over the code. All right, ready? Let's look at the code piece by piece. First, we're going to create a local int variable called sum to hold our total. Now we're going to traverse through all the values in the array. We're going to do this using a for loop. And so our loop is going to have an int I equals 0 to start, and our boundary I less than values.length. Every time we extract a value, bracket I, from the array, we're going to add that to sum. And again, we're using that loop variable I to indicate the index here. Then after the loop is complete, we can return the average by dividing the sum by the number of values in the array. We'll use values.length. Notice we also cast sum into a double here, and that allows for decimals in our average, which might happen. And as you can see in the method header, this method is supposed to return a double anyway. All right, let's look at our next algorithm. We want to determine the number of elements in an array that have a particular property. So in this case, we'll count the number of states that end with a particular letter. So remember that initializer list that we used to initialize the string array called states in our last video? Here we have the same thing. So we have an array of string called states. It contains these 8 states here. And let's say I want to determine how many states end with the letter A. So I'm going to need to have a counter, something to keep track, like a tally mark, every time I find a string that meets this condition. Now I'll have to traverse through the array. I'll start with Florida, and Florida ends in an A, so I added 1 to my counter. Texas doesn't end with an A, so I'm okay here. Oh, Arizona ends with an A, so now my counter is going to be incremented to 2. Ohio, New York, California ends with an A, so now my counter is 3. Oregon doesn't end with an A. And finally, Georgia. Georgia ends with an A, so my counter is going to be 4. So I found 4 states that end with the letter A. I found and counted the number of strings that ended with that particular condition. Now, here I have a static method called number of states that end with. This is going to be a static method that takes in a string letter, and letter is a string with a length of 1, as it says in the comments, and an array of string called states. We're going to send our states array here. Notice that it returns an int because I'm counting how many states end with a particular letter. So what does the code look like? Why don't you go ahead and pause here and take a shot at writing this method before we go over the code together. All right, here we go. So we're going to start off this method by declaring and initializing a counter to 0. Then once again, we're going to traverse our array, and we're going to use our traditional for loop. We could have used an enhanced for loop here as well, but for right now, let's use our traditional for loop, I equals 0, I less than states.length, I plus plus. And if the current string ends with the letter that we're looking for. So how do we do this? We're going to check to see if our current string ends with a letter. We'll do this by using the substring method and the parameters states I.length minus 1. That extracts the last letter of our current string, and we're going to use the dot equals to compare it to letter. Now, since we used an initializer list for this array, we're going to go ahead here and assume that there are no null values in the array. But that might be something that you want to check for before you use the substring method. Otherwise, you might throw a null pointer exception if you try to use the substring method on a null object. If we do find a string that has a last letter that matches our parameter letter, then we're going to increment our counter by saying counter plus plus. And then finally, after the loop has completed, we'll return the total number of states ending in the letter that we found by returning counter. And that's our algorithm for determining the number of elements in our array that had that particular property. In this case, they all ended with a particular letter. All right, on to our last algorithm. Finding a particular value. Let's say we want to determine if at least one element of our array has a particular property. So for this example, we're going to look for a particular state name. So remember, here's our states, and here's our array full of strings that are state names. And let's say we want to determine if we have a particular name such as New York. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to traverse through and search our array. We visit each element in the array, and we see if it equals New York. Well, in position 0, that's Florida. That doesn't equal New York. Texas doesn't equal New York. Position 2, Arizona, nope. Position 3, Ohio, does not equal New York. There's New York in spot 4. I found it. Now remember, I just want to know if it exists or not. We can stop traversing here. This algorithm is a little bit different than the other ones in this video because I don't need to loop through the entire array. Once I found the existence of New York in the array, I'm done. All right, let's put our algorithm to code. So here I have an array of strings called states, and I have a parameter target, which is the string that I'm looking for. Notice this is a method called contain state, and it returns a Boolean. So it's going to return true if it found the state in the array and return false otherwise. Again, feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to try and code this one on your own first. Okay, here we go. Let's look at it together. So we need to traverse the array, and this time I'm going to use an enhanced for loop. Again, this is totally optional. We could have used either type of for loop here. So for each string, I'm going to call it state name within states. If the state name dot equals the target parameter, if that happens, then I found the state that I'm looking for. So what am I going to do? I'm going to immediately return true. But what if it's not equal? Do we have an else return false? Well, no, we're not going to do that because that would cause us to return immediately after we examine the first element of our array, regardless of whether or not we found a match. If we found a match, we want to return true. But if we don't find a match, we need to keep searching until we find target. If we go all the way through the loop and we never found a match, then we can return false after the loops have completed, indicating that target just wasn't in our array. All right, that completes our algorithm to determine if we can find an element of an array with a particular property. All right, so in this video, we developed code for standard and original algorithms and determined the result of those algorithms. Specifically, we found the average value of an array, we counted the number of elements in an array, or that had a particular property, and we searched an array for the existence of a particular value. And we'll do more algorithms in our next videos. All right, that's it for this video today. Thanks again for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time. Take care.